So I'm thrilled to introduce tonight's first speaker, Anya Sirota. Anya, alongside her partner Jean-Louis Farge, manages Akoaki Architecture and Design in Detroit, Michigan. Anya received her Bachelor of Arts in Modern Culture and Media from Brown University and earned her Master of Architecture degree from Harvard Graduate School of Design, where she earned the Araldo Cosuta Prize for Design Excellence. Anya is tenured faculty at Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Michigan and also directs the ArchPrep program in Detroit. Since 2008, Akoaki has established a reputation for innovative and resonant projects that critically engage the social, spatial, and material realities of place. Akoaki is the winner of a Research and Design Award from Architect Magazine for the project Electroformalism, an ACSA Faculty Design Award for the same project, and a South by Southwest ECO Place by Design Architecture and Interaction Award for their project, the Mothership, among many other awards as well. Unapologetically bridging the commonly perceived divide between social and aesthetic practice, their work aims at producing experiences and forms that they describe as joyful, ornamental, vivacious, and maybe even blingy in complex and contested urban scenarios. The practice explores how architecture as a mechanism of collective social transformation can instigate novel urban morphologies, and perhaps also vice versa. The approach is interested in the playful ways that architecture can participate in public discourse, striving perhaps to produce an objective engagement through notions of cultural familiarity and inclusion, while also cultivating space for freshness and individual or subjective experience. Please join me in welcoming Anya Sirota.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction. That was fabulous. I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to present this work today to such an esteemed audience, where I know so many of you in this audience and have worked with you or have studied with you, so it's wonderful to see so many familiar faces. Thank you to the Architecture League for the opportunity and for the esteemed jury for selecting this work as part of this kind of emergent conversation. I couldn't be more happy to be in the bracket of a still young architect. It's been phenomenal to be selected to be that. And though I'm on the tail end probably of the Young Architecture bracket prize, I'm still utopian in my aspirations with my partner Jean-Louis, and hope that we can share a little bit about the work that we've been doing in the past few years. One of the titles of the talk that we were thinking about was Objects with Objectives. And so over the course of the past 10 years, we've been working very diligently on creating a number of objects in the urban realm and studying the way they produce social phenomenon, but also tell stories about context, stories that might otherwise seem invisible. So sometimes we build big pop objects like this one in Amilly, France, where the very production of the object was rendered explicit as a performance that spanned over the length of a month, where everyone in town was invited to participate and learn about vernacular American construction practice as we produced this intervention at an abandoned tannery. Sometimes we work on creating materials and ways of manufacturing new materials in architecture. For example, the Electroformalism project that we launched about 6 years ago, which looked at the economy of creating aggregated tile in an infinitely diverse system, a tessellated, infinitely diverse tile system, and looked at how we might be able to reactivate 19th century fabrication techniques by creating mobile, deployable microfabrication units. We were inspired by the context in which we work. So this is an image of the rooftop of the Packard plant in Detroit, which is a typical kind of post-industrial landscape. We call it a kind of monument to capital extraction, where years of scrapping have produced a very particular kind of landscape and brought up questions about how to manage that landscape and how architecture might participate in the flux of materials that happen globally. Sometimes we produce unsolicited architectural interventions like this one, called General Manifold, that was installed in an abandoned factory in Chelsea, Michigan, called Federal Screw Works. We were delighted by the title of the factory, and we're very excited to work there. These unsolicited architectural interventions, sometimes we call them pop actions, and we think about them as ways of drawing attention to the value and possibility of spaces that might otherwise be unseen. So this was an intervention that we built with permission from the owner of the factory, and we launched it at an event where we talked about the power and prowess and emergence of ruin porn. We worked with Playboy bunny Brandy Moses, whose voice you can hear now, as she reads seminal texts by Viollet Leduc and John Ruskin. We also look at this idea of atmosphere as being a kind of abundant and ambient resource for architecture. So this is a project that we developed with Meredith Miller at Taubman College at the University of Michigan that looks at this idea that we're surrounded by particles, vapors, atmosphere, that if we begin to control it intentionally, we might be able to produce new ornamental effects using very economic means. So we're literally looking at ways that we might be able to train frost to produce ornament on buildings using electromagnetic forces powered with solar panels. We also love pop, punch, graphics, and sometimes we work on creating interventions that test the possibility of human occupation of the supergraphic. This is a project that we produced with the Los Angeles-based architect Stephen Christensen called Beta Movement that tested that possibility of creating a saturated experience using very simple vernacular materials and geometric opportunities. This project was inserted into a storefront on Hollywood Boulevard, and it explored how this kind of calibrated spatial possibility can produce social affordances where people begin to act and occupy space and imagine their own red carpet moment. So all of these efforts, like Molly introduced in the introduction, they attempt to bridge a kind of commonly perceived divide between social and aesthetic practice. And they look at a way of creating a distinct synthesis between aesthetics, social enterprise, and cultural programming. In the process, we look to suggest ways that architecture might gain agency, might participate in public discourse, and might address the perennial criticism of our field, namely its contingency on power and capital. So to uncover methods by which we do things differently, we attempt to kind of materialize our utopian ambitions and look to veer away from typical models of patronage, which means that we often find ourselves working in economically challenged contexts where we need to identify our own sites, our own clients. We build our networks of people interested in producing the work with us. And we begin to investigate ways of amplifying locally contingent cultural programming and securing funds. And all of this activity happens before design even begins. So what I'd like to say is that we're investigating ways that interventionist projects can communicate greater ambitions in the urban realm and render explicit that there are many communities and spaces for architecture to operate which might not normally have a relationship to our discipline and practice, but that there are ways for us to have a more robust and activist relationship to those sites of possibility. So in an effort to unpack how we work and the ways that we work, there are three major elements that find their way again and again into our activity as a studio. The first is iconicity, and here we kind of have to go back to a 90s semiotic rendition of sign and signifier. But if iconicity is the relationship between a form and its meaning, a kind of implicit relationship, then we're looking for ways to mine local context for the ideal icon to deliver a kind of narrative punch so that we can render explicit something that is otherwise invisible about a given context in which we're working. So if we get that iconicity right, if it's generative, then its meaning is often preceding the meaning of our own research in a particular context. So let me unpack it a little further. This is Oakland Avenue in Detroit. It is the main commercial strip of the North End neighborhood, which is a historically African-American neighborhood very close to the city center. It's distinct because it captures many narratives and much of the local imaginary about what was a very lively and exciting space in the city. Today, a visitor to the North End would be hard-pressed to read any of the signs that local residents might read in the way that they perceive their neighborhood. The statistics are a little bit glum. So 70% of the buildings are missing in the North End. 40% of the population is living below the poverty rate. There are very high rates of illiteracy, but this is a 95% African-American neighborhood that's been historically living in this place and taking care of the North End for quite a few generations. So while this landscape is illegible and difficult to read as a kind of site of potential, we began working there and starting to understand how we could possibly see this as an instigator for architectural work. So this is the Apex Bar on Oakland Avenue, a rather innocuous vernacular commercial building. And when we first looked at it, we couldn't read anything particular about the site. But very soon, we discovered that John Lee Hooker had written "Boom, Boom, Boom" in this building, and he'd occupied the second floor of this building for a number of years. Or we discovered this storefront. Again, nothing extraordinary, kind of layering of advertising and aerosol art. And then we discovered that Bootsy Collins purchased his first pair of sunglasses in the store some years back. And then finally, we discovered the Phelps Lounge. And the Phelps Lounge, it had a particularly powerful grip on the collective imaginary. This apparently was the site where George Clinton transformed into Dr. Funkenstein over the span of 3 eventful performances. And so anyone we talked to over a certain age in the neighborhood had an incredibly powerful connection to George Clinton, the kind of father of funk. And we began to learn more about the music in the neighborhood and the fact that many of the working class musicians who had started off working with George Clinton still lived in the neighborhood. And that kind of symbolic order, the Afro-futurist aesthetic that George Clinton introduced was very powerful in the collective imaginary. So we started to think about how we might be able to, channel, we do it one more time, it's testy. How we might be able to channel some of that history of place in order to produce a signifier that could communicate some of that cultural production, the prowess, the possibility, the excitement. And this is what we did as a diagram. This is the production of a diagram of our project for the Mothership, which we thought would be a good way to communicate the aspiration of a flying saucer, of a mobile DJ booth that could activate open space, vacant space in the community. And so this is the object that we built, a blingy space capsule that channels some of the aesthetic sensibility of the original, but updates it by using car customization techniques, gold vinyl, apertures, psychedelic effects on the skin. And then it cracks open to reveal the DJ inside. So whether that's nighttime or daytime, we use an ample amount of smoke. It's a little scary. Then when it's not functioning as a DJ booth and there's an event happening, it works as a kind of urban signifier, lighting up open territory and illustrating that events are happening. Sometimes the mothership travels a bit far. Here it is in Flint with Ife Bay at the festival. And more often than not, the mothership lives in an unmarked garage that we call the 1 Mile Project, where over the course of the last 4 years, the mothership has been the instigator of events where anyone in the community could use the space to create performances. This goes on. There are many performances. The second idea that we refer to often in our practice is this notion of a hauntological aesthetic. So rather than looking for purely citational means as the matter with which we imagine novel aesthetics, we try to borrow this idea from Derrida that you can layer the original signifier. We might not be able to arrive at its original meaning, but when we feel that multiple times and multiple spaces coexist, there's something magical that happens in our cognition. So this is a project called the Detroit Afrikan Funkestra set, which we designed in order to be able to produce performances in open spaces, in this case at the Oakland Avenue Urban Farm. And to make this object hauntological in its sensibilities, we looked at all of the existing music venues in the neighborhood and tried to create a sensibility about their place, about their shape, about their power and prowess in the collective imaginary. So this is the interior of this Bluebird Inn, and that stage is the stage where John Coltrane played on a number of occasions. And it's made of very simple materials, plywood, sparkle motion, simple house paint, very small in scale, very intimate. And we tried to channel some of the sensibilities of those kinds of spaces in creating the new signifier, the new stage set. So we looked at the Apex Bar, Bluebird, and the Phelps, and we cited their colors, the shapes of their stages, the way they created shapes and forms. We came up with this kind of hybrid backdrop, a stage set that combined all of the aesthetic qualities of the sites that were in the process of disappearing in the neighborhood. So this kind of set produces activity in the most unlikely spaces. This is the Detroit Afrikan Funkestra playing just feet away from a field of kale and beesop plants. But for a brief moment, it produces the possibility of a collective activity in a site where very few signifiers are available to create a sense of continuity between what has once existed and a future possibility. This is the beat jazz cyborg Onyx Ashanti playing with the band. And the way we put these figures together is very simple, again, using vernacular materials, a kind of puzzle piece that can be brought together using hand tools and configured on site to produce pop effects. And here it is, traveling to the Saint-Étienne Biennale, reconfigured for a larger scale site. And finally, the technique that we turn to very often is the kind of situational ethos, the idea that architecture can sponsor activity, not just through its signification, but through its connection to locally rooted culture and programming. 2 years ago, we began working with a group of artists who were really concerned that Detroit's Art Council had been closed many years even before the bankruptcy. And so these artists were interested in creating an artifact to both instigate situational activity, but also to disseminate a narrative about the need for a new cultural council in Detroit. So this is an arch that we produced that was designed to clip on to existing buildings, and when it was clipped onto those buildings, to signify that a collective institutional entity was in session. So working with these artists, we produced a number of events that were signifiers, but also ways of drawing attention to a political scenario in Detroit. And the basic idea is that architecture could both build the arch, the signifier, the threshold to the cultural activity, but also help build a parallel institution. The arch itself was composed of local artifacts designed by artists that we reconfigured, even our own. Our Mothership made it into our self-reflexive arch. But also figures from architecture that had disappeared in the city, affinities from Sun Ra and Afrofuturist Spaces the Place films, a kind of Egyptian imaginary, culled from the possibility of an alternate aesthetic future. And so once the arch is clipped on, social activity begins to happen. Here we have the artist Bree Grant talking about issues of her art practice in Detroit, and Cornelius Harris, who is one of the founders of Underground Resistance, also talking about the need for a culture council in Detroit. And so here it is as a figure on its own. So finally, why produce so many parties, so many ephemeral events? Why so much activity? To what end? To what end are we making these objects in the field? Over the course and in parallel to the production of those objects, we also were working on a larger master plan. And this was a master plan for a 6-acre commons, a civic commons, collectively owned by a nonprofit in the neighborhood, and many stakeholders who were interested in creating a space for collective activity on the site of the Oakland Avenue urban farm. So this is that 6-acre master plan that we were working on. And the way the project started was by us looking at ownership models in Detroit and understanding that many of the farms in Detroit are not sustainable in the true sense of the word. And also they operate on squatted land. So this is a map that shows the properties that are owned by speculators in Detroit. It represents more than 25% of the city. And this is a map that shows the properties that are owned by the land bank, that are held by the land bank. So we started to look at the way speculators were operating in Detroit. What are their ways of purchasing land? What are their techniques? What are their methods? And we imitated some of their techniques by bringing together a group of moral investors who together attempted to purchase and gift land to the urban farm to create a land trust. So over the course of 2 years, we were able to secure the 6 acres for the production of the Civic Commons. And currently, we're working on 3 of the permanent infrastructures to create a series of cultural assets for the North End community. So for example, the store, which we hope to transform into a community kitchen and housing complex in the North End. Feed the rhythm, feel the beat. I'm sorry. And then we're also we're working on transforming a residential house into a hostel. And this is the section of that structure. And finally, this month, we're starting the rehabilitation of the historic Red's Jazz Shoeshine, which was once a shoeshine with an amazing speakeasy in the back, where Smokey Robinson played and other tremendously famous vanguard musicians. And so we're looking to reactivate that program as well. So our ephemeral interventions help draw attention to the possibilities of cultural programming, civic assets, and investment in communities where normally investment is very difficult to achieve. We've been able to raise more than $1.2 million over the course of the last 5 years to realize some of these projects. And in the meantime, we've also looked at modes of representation that could be more inclusive and can communicate with a broader audience. So looking at the work that you'll see in the gallery, this is a sample of the way that we've been exploring ways that architecture can communicate through pop graphics, bright colors, legibility, being literal in the aspirations of the artifacts that we're deploying in the field. So with that, I wanted to thank the New York Architecture League again, Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning for the amazing support the university has shown over the course of these last years. I'd like to call out Jonathan Watkins and Sarah Carter, Jordan Luria, and Freddie Foote, who have been so instrumental in helping produce that exhibit, but also the amazing past and present Akoaki participants in our shape-shifting enterprise and collective experiments. So thank you so much, and thanks for your attention.